Welcome back to Questing Beast. I am Ben, and today we have another episode of Ask Dungeon Masters, where I invite a few guest hosts on to help me answer some of your RPG questions. Today, I'm joined by the creators of two of my favorite RPG review channels, Bud from Bud's RPG Review and Dave from Captcorajus, both of whose channels can be found down in the links below. Thank you both for joining me today. And Bud, do you want to start off by introducing yourself and what your channel is all about?
Well, my name's Bud. Normally, people only ever see my hands, but I've become a bit braver over the last 2 years through having to stay home all the time. My channel does, I do reviews of a lot of things. I seem to have a bit of a focus on Delta Green, and I do like quite in-depth deep dives on big campaigns. Things like I've just done Impossible Landscapes, and I've done all of Masks of Nyarlathotep and things like that.
Great. Dave, do you want to introduce yourself and your channel?
Sure. Captcorajus, that's me. Channel usually goes by RPG Retro Reviews. That's generally the best way to find me. And I review old school modules and games and a lot of OSR material, like Old School Essentials and Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorceries of Hyperborea and that kind of things. I have a couple of DM Foundry things where I talk about how to run a sandbox campaign and some tips on how to dungeon master and those kinds of things, and some few projects and things here and there, but it's mostly old school reviews.
Great. Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to have both of you on is that I think between the three of us, we kind of cover slightly different niches. Like I mostly do OSR stuff, but it tends to be newer releases. Dave, you tend to do a lot more like TSR stuff, like actually old modules. And Bud tends to cover a lot of older stuff, but out of the D&D sphere. So I think between the three of us, we have a lot of really good coverage of the different types of games out there. Before we get started though, quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Into the AM and their series of fantasy and horror themed t-shirts. One of their new designs is one I'm wearing right now. It would work really well if you're running any kind of Lovecraftian or investigative horror campaign. If you use the link in the description below, you can get 10% off of their entire web store. And then on top of that, they also have deals going on where for $60, you can get 3 t-shirts in a bundle. I've been wearing these t-shirts for a long time now. They're really comfortable, they're really affordable, and I strongly recommend them. Thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the show. And we're back. Let's jump into some of the questions that you submitted from both the Patreon and from over on my channel. But did you have one that you wanted to look at?
Yes, there was one I wanted to look at. I'm not going to talk about the Thousand Thrones question because that's just bait.
It's a troll.
It is. It's just troll, and he knows who he is. There was a question about from Ketchup Gun. Is there a way to OSR with kids? I find they're very attached to their characters and love being overly heroic. So I've abandoned the concept entirely as I can't see it fitting. And I think that was a bit of a puzzling question because there's something implicit in it. I think what's implicit in that question is that OSR and being heroic and enjoying your characters are two entirely separate things. And I don't agree with that because the people I know who played D&D back in the day never thought of it like that. They always played their characters heroically and were attached to the characters. I've got many friends who had D&D characters all the way up to level 30. You know, from playing the original BX onwards. I just think it's a bit of a strange question. Is there a way to OSR with kids? I kind of feel it's kind of aimed at D&D 5th edition slightly, with it being so difficult to die, but it seems to imply that death is a part of OSR. And I'm not sure I entirely agree with it. What do you guys think?
Well, both of my daughters started playing Dungeons and Dragons when they were 10 years old. So I have some experience with this. And I think that you can play them just fine, and they can be just as heroic and enjoy the game, especially an OSR game. I can relate a story that I told my daughter Crystal. She was playing a rogue. They were going through the Keep on the Borderlands module. And I was playing with 2 of my older friends who had been with me since high school. So it was a mix of my kids and some older friends. And she was scouting ahead because she was the rogue. And as my my friend Trav would say, "You're the burglar. Go ahead and burgle." As is frequently said. She saw a set of gold pieces hovering in the air, just kind of mingling. And I checked to see if she happened to catch the fact that she was looking through something, if you know what I'm saying. And of course, my friend Jim and Travis are kind of sitting there nudge, because they know exactly what's up. And so she went to reach for the coins and of course got ensnared by a gelatinous cube. And the scream she let out was one that any B-movie queen would be proud of. It was really quite epic. As I described the pseudopod of the gelatinous cube reaching out and drawing her in, and the acidic juices beginning to dissolve her flesh. It was great. She didn't die, but she was amusingly traumatized, we shall say, and she still talks about that fondly to this day. So I would say it was perfectly okay. And really, kids are all different. You got to gauge what your kids can deal with. My kids could have dealt with the death of a character if that happened, but it didn't happen. They progressed quite high in level and they had a great time. And my oldest daughter, Autumn, still plays with me to this day. She's 26.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I got my start running running games for kids. I ran after school clubs where I ran mostly with 10-year-olds. And I did this for years and years. And my experience was that OSR rule sets were especially good for kids, mostly because they're so easy to pick up. Like you can start playing without knowing virtually any rules, which is less the case in more modern editions of D&D. In old school stuff, I can just give you a character sheet and say, don't even worry about the numbers right now. Just tell me what you're doing. And then maybe I'll call for you to try and roll against one of these numbers if we need to. So they can pick it up really fast. And so much of the game is just diegetic. So it's just about what's happening inside the world. And they just get into that mindset and you can play most of the game that way. And then in terms of like character lethality and character death, it didn't happen. I think it does tend to happen less often than people say it does in OSR games, if players are even relatively smart. But it doesn't happen that often. And when it does, my players usually weren't that attached to their characters. My feeling is that kids, that's less true for kids, where they don't tend to just completely identify as their character. They hold them a little bit more lightly, almost like they're like action figures that they're maneuvering. And when they die, like, yeah, they're not happy that their character died, but they can just get another character and it's not that big of a deal. At least that's been my experience.
I agree. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. One other thing I've started playing with some of my kids who are like 6 and 9 right now. And what I'm trying is I'm actually not giving them one character, I'm giving them several. So they actually have like 3 or 4 really simple characters, kind of like a funnel in Dungeon Crawl Classics, where these really simple characters, so that if one dies, it's not that big of a deal because they literally have more, and it zooms out a little bit. So it's like they're controlling a little party. And that's actually worked out pretty well so far. So that could be another way to try it.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
DCC, sorry, go on.
Go ahead, no, yeah.
So DCC funnels feel a bit to me like Paranoia back in the day, where you had a stack of characters and character death was meant to be fun in Paranoia. And I've played DCC a couple of times. When I played a funnel, it was always how fun the character could die, because you always had another one who could just step in back in in the place.
Paranoia was a great game.
Absolutely.
It really was.
Dave, do you have a question you wanted to look at?
Well, I think like the very first question that caught my eye was the one where do I see the OSR heading in the future? And this question is kind of near and dear to my heart because I really feel that a lot of negativity has become associated with the OSR in recent years. And I think that the way forward is through positivity. I think that if people are going to be playing the OSR in 10 and 20 years, it's going to be because it gets passed on to future generations. That there are some folks that are playing modern iterations of the game right now who are going to go through the same thing that we all did. We all went through it, where we went away from D&D for a while when we tried other things. We may have came back, and I mean, I played 2 full campaigns with 5th edition, and I played a lot of other role-playing games. I played back in the day, I played Hero Quest and Fantasy Hero and a whole bunch of other different things that I tried and mingled around with. So I think that's going to be the natural progression with all of the influx of players coming in. And there's an opportunity there with modern iterations, such as Old School Essentials and Castles and Crusades and other things that have these very clean and modern takes with their rules, but still the old school style, which I think is very appealing. So I like 5th edition, and but I find that a lot of times it's a mood killer with in certain aspects. For example, you're narrating that there's a dingy, muddy, mucky swamp, and you all are trudging through the heat and the insects and what have you, and you finally find a piece of land where you can rest yourself and take a break, and the wizard comes over and casts prestidigitation as a cantrip over and over and cleans everybody up, which kind of is a mood killer in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, 5e is really designed around removing a lot of the logistical elements that you would have to think about in older versions of the game, either because mostly cantrips are a huge part of that. That and not having an encumbrance system is something that I complain about a lot, where when you don't have an encumbrance system, not everyone likes that. I understand that it's a thing you have to track, but once you take that system away, then no one really tracks what they carry anymore. You can carry a basically infinite amount of things. That's what ends up happening. And the logistical element is lost, where you're thinking carefully about what you can carry and what you have to drop when you pick up new stuff. So that's something I really like that I think 5th edition lost. But something in terms of the OSR moving forward, what I think is probably going to be happening is an increased move away from, I think, what Patrick Stewart called the BX Commons, which is the general compatibility of everything with BX D&D, and more towards making systems and adventures that are more broadly compatible with, like, OSR principles and just the style of play. I see that happening more and more in terms of the stuff that people are putting out. And I think there's something that's lost when you're not making games that are compatible with old school D&D, because then you lose a lot of stuff that you can bring in. But you're also going to be able to expand the kind of rules that you have. And I've seen a lot of people moving towards more procedural OSR, where they're building all sorts of little rules modules that add on procedures for interacting with the world at a higher scale. Like more stuff with downtime, more stuff with building castles and controlling armies and things like that. So I'm really excited to see where that goes in the future.
Well, with the OSR, downtime is kind of automatically built into the system. It happens without you really having to say, okay, now we're going to have some downtime. For example, if you're hurt and injured, you don't heal overnight. You've got to stop and you've got to heal. Also, when you're low level, especially wizards can scribe scrolls, and it can take a week to scribe a scroll. So you guys got to hang out in town and scribe some scrolls, let the wizard do his thing, let him do some research. And that's where the fun happens. That's where the barbarian goes into the tavern and gets a little bit wasted and maybe has an encounter that he didn't plan on and starts a little trouble. And that leads to something else, all the while the wizard's away doing his thing. And maybe the thief is checking out the Thieves Guild and trying to see what kind of jobs he can get there. So there's some integrated automatic downtime based on what the character class's abilities are, and the lack of ready access to automatic overnight healing that means downtime happens, but you actually don't have to have a downtime rule, if you know what I'm saying.
I think as well, I mean, with regard to the future of OSR, there's a bigger picture to look at, because one day 5th Ed is going to be retro. And those players who play in 5th Ed now, who can't understand why people would want to play OSR style games, are going to have the same feeling when the people who are playing it in the future are looking at D&D 5th edition. And I mean, I'm a fan of D&D 4th edition, a rare thing. And I often see criticism for D&D 4th edition by people who never played D&D 4th edition. And it's only one edition away from the current edition. So if you move forward 30 years, similar to how the original D&D is held in the regard that it is. If you move forward 30 years, it's going to be fifth ed. That's going to be sat in that position. I mean, God only knows what's going to be happening with D&D at that point, 60 years in the future. But I think attitudes are going to shift slightly, because people play the new and shiny, don't they? They tend to.
Sure.
But you always gravitate to the kind of thing you enjoyed the most. It's kind of the reason why my two favorite games remain RuneQuest and Warhammer, because RuneQuest was the first game I ever played. So that love for it never went. And Warhammer was the first game I ever bought. So when I think of retro, I don't think of D&D, I think of those games. Luckily, they've kind of moved on, and I think the difference between D&D and 5th edition D&D, or original BD&D and 5th edition D&D is there's quite a gulf in the middle for my money. But for those other games like RuneQuest and Warhammer, the gulf's not so big. So yeah, I think it's going to be an attitude change in the future, because it'll be the people who love it, D&D now, having to kind of justify why they love it in 30 years.
And there's such a massive number of people that have picked up 5th edition as their first edition, right? I saw stats that like Wizards of the Coast, or D&D in general, has grown every single year for the last like 7 years or something crazy like that. It's more popular now than it was at the height of the 80s and the Satanic Panic. So there's just millions of people for whom this will be the nostalgic version. And I'm really curious to see what people will think looking back at 5e, and if like the style of play will change going on from there, and like what will be the emblematic style of play from this era of D&D.
I saw something. There's a Kickstarter going on for Arcane virtual tabletop. Really interesting. It has a different kind of take than anything I've seen before, in that it's got a augmented reality tabletop where you're putting together the thing, and then the dungeon appears on your tabletop when you look at it through your phone or your iPad, which is very cool. And you can either choose to play at the table that way, or you could play thousands of miles apart if you wanted to. So I think that there's going to be a lot of integration with technology and tabletop role-playing games in general. And I would think that the future of Dungeons and Dragons, and if you look at what they just did with D&D Beyond, I think there's the future of Dungeons and Dragons right there, with people playing in an augmented way. It's going to be very exciting.
I think like the last 2 years has helped that, hasn't it?
It's ubiquitous right now. So
yeah, COVID's really accelerated that, and you know that Wizards is really big on that too. They just bought D&D Beyond for like 147 million or something ridiculous.
I thought they already owned it.
Yeah, everyone did.
Genuinely.
Yeah, it looks like it does. All the branding is the same. It's owned by someone else apparently,
which is why it was so attractive to them. They did a great job with it.
Yeah. I'm sure that's going to be huge. People are going to be playing digitally a lot more going forward, especially if you have more VR tools. One thing that you mentioned 4th edition that reminded me. There's a Kickstarter right now that Matt Colville is launching for his monster book. And what I found fascinating about it is that I looked through the little preview, and it has a lot of 4th edition DNA in there, where he's taking a lot of the ideas from the way that monsters worked, where they were much more, 4th edition had a much bigger focus on making fights really tactically interesting, where monsters all had unique things that they could do to manipulate the battlefield. And then 5e really dialed that back. And this is really bringing that back again. And what's even more interesting is that this monster book is supposed to replace the 5e monster manual, not supplement it. So it's like it's the beginning of this. It reminds me a little bit of when Pathfinder took over 3e. I mean, Matt Colville's not as big as Paizo was, but it's the first time I've seen like a big 5e creator create a book that's in direct competition with Wizards and saying, no, we're going to make the same book, but better. So that'll be really interesting to see what happens going forward with that.
See, the problem with 4th edition, and I'm not blind to the problems of 4th edition, but you were saying about this new book has a lot of the DNA of 4th edition. People conveniently skip over the fact that 5th edition has a lot of DNA from 4th edition. Things like death saves, things like at will powers, these are all from 4th edition. And healing surges versus healing hit dice. It's essentially the same thing. The issue, I mean, currently in, I say currently, we haven't played them in a couple of years, but I'm in 2 campaigns for 4th edition. We're doing Scales of War and the Prince of Undeath one, I think the Orcus campaign. And the problem we're having is as you go up in level, the battles become longer due to conditions. And I think you're right, 5th Ed has dialed right back. We had a single combat that lasted 3 sessions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a Dracolich, 3 whole sessions due to conditions and being able to manipulate other people's goes, and it ended up becoming a bit of a tangled mess when you got to the higher levels. And then you're right, D&D 5th Ed has dialed that back because it needed to be dialed back, to be honest.
I 100%
but there were a lot of
agree with
great
you,
things
bud.
about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really got me with 4th edition was you had ability scores like you can move that monster over 1 square, or you can move, the commander can move his goblins all over 1 square, which implied you had to have a grid, first of all. That's the major that's a major problem. You had to have a grid. And the second of all, that doesn't make any sense to me. You know, in a role-playing game, I mean, it's great if it's a tactical miniatures game. Awesome. But if you're playing a role-playing game in the context of a fantasy reality, moving somebody over a square, how does that relate to the world that you're living in? What is that? You know, what is that doing? I don't understand that. So it doesn't make any logical sense. And like when I'm standing around in the world that I'm in, I don't suddenly move over to a square because somebody, you know, it's just, you know, that role-playing game and the tactical aspects of it versus a board game. I think the biggest issue with 4E is that it kind of made that a little bit mingled. It blurred the line there a little bit too much.
Yeah, I mean, it gets worse than that. In our campaign, we've got a warlord and we've got a rogue, and the rogue would have all of his goes, and then the warlord would spend his entire go giving the rogue another go. So the rogue was just decimating everything. We used to joke that the rogue's legs had wasted away because he never walked anywhere. The warlord moved them. But I think what you've got to bear in mind with 4th edition is it was released at the same time as World of Warcraft was at its height, and you can completely see that in the game. In you know, the kind of striker, the tanks were obviously being the warriors who could mark people and things like that. You can see that in the game.
I think there was a vision.
I'm not sure D&D suited it, to be fair. And 5th Ed moved away from that kind of overly tactical game. It didn't stop it being a good game in its own right. And people get angry when you say this, but I'm going to say it didn't feel like D&D. But I've played D&D. I mean, I ran a 14-year AD&D campaign, and it didn't feel like that one bit.
Yeah. I think like the big like tension at Wizards when they're doing these game design is 4th edition went really hard on more abstract rules, right? All the gameplay, which was focused on combat, was very abstractly interesting. You had all these interlocking rules, and it was more chess-like. This guy affects this guy, and then this allows you to do this, and you could plan things out like that. But then like the other end of the spectrum, which I guess is more OSR, is heavy emphasis on like making things diegetically interesting, where like what's happening in the world imaginatively is interesting, and that affects your tactics, but it's not in a rule-bound way. And then 5e tried to kind of go in between that and have the character classes still have rules for how you can attack and how you can move that kind of implies a grid, but you don't necessarily have to have one. But they're still pushing things more towards natural language and away from things being really rule bound. And I think that they're still sort of stuck in between there trying to figure out what path to take, because the impulse of people to go to really focus on building characters and building strategies that are rule bound is really strong. You see that on YouTube, especially. Like everyone wants to create optimized characters. Everyone wants to figure out what's the best way to do this thing. People's like brains just like love that. They can't get away from it. So it's really hard to have a game that appeals to both sides. And I don't know where they're going to go in like 5.5, which I know they're developing right now.
I can't see it being a big shift.
Yeah.
I can see it being more like 3.5 from 3rd edition. I mean, they don't want to alienate this giant fan base that's bought all these millions of books, do they?
Yeah.
They're at the same position that they were looking at with TSR was looking at when they went from first edition to second edition. They wanted to make it compatible with the first edition stuff, so they wouldn't alienate all the people that bought all the other books and all the other modules. And then you had a big shift when you went from second edition to third edition. Then the game changed from a more to a more codified system. So I think you have a shift between uncodified and codified. So if you look at first edition Dungeons and Dragons, there's no rule for jumping. You'll not find it.
I didn't realize that.
There's no rule. There's no jump rule. But jumping happens all the time, obviously. So how did it happen? Well, if you look in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and Ben, I know you did this, you'll see that there's a 2-page discussion, or I think it's 2 pages, on bell curve probabilities versus linear curves and dices. Why is that there? Well, the Dungeon Master was expected to come up with rules on the fly. So an understanding of how die curves works and linear curves, the difference, and how to calculate probabilities, it's very important for the Dungeon Master to know these things. So that's why that rule is there. That's why and when you look back at that now in this year, this day and age, you look, why was he so intricate on his bell curve probabilities? And that's why, because the DM was going to come up with a rule on jumping on the fly based on the situation.
Yeah, like AD&D starts off with like a crash course in game design, which is like, what? Why are you telling me how to design games? That's why I bought this. Like, no, like as a game master, we have a book of rules for you, but you're also expected to be a game designer in many instances, because you have to come up with rules for all sorts of situations. And here's how I would do it as Gary Gygax. And I just find that really fascinating. Not a lot of books have done that since, where they talk about, they go under the hood and they show you like how game master or how game designers think about this stuff, so that you as a game master can bring that into your own game. Because more and more, it's more of a black box where they just, they don't tell you how things work under the hood. They just give you the rules and then you apply them and you see what comes out the other end. So there's less of an engagement on the game master's part on that side of it.
Right. So 5th edition has that in the under the hood aspect of its rule system, and the term for it is coming up, but it's a codified what do they call it?
Bounded accuracy.
Bounded accuracy is the under the hood rule there that I'm looking for. Thank you, Ben. But exactly. So that's in the background for all the rules for everything you do with 5th edition. And if you violate that, you do so at your own peril.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder how many people actually use those bell curves, really, or who just said, "Oh, give us a dex roll or whatever," for the sake of expediency.
Well, when you say give me a dex roll, do you want to roll 3d6, which integrates that there's going to be an average between 12 and 13 for success, or do you want to roll a d20, which is going to give you a linear curves where all numbers have the same probability? Whether or not you do that or not depends on how. You see what I'm saying? So
see, this is why we can't have nice things.
Or like even worse, the way that AD&D will it'll say, here's a monster and its hit points could be anywhere from 4 to 53. And you're like, wait, what does that mean? It doesn't tell you the actual hit dice. It just tells you like the hit point range you could have, and you have to figure out, you have to reverse engineer what those dice would be to make that. Oh, it's crazy. Like, I don't know why you would do that.
To be fair, I just would write 53, to be honest.
Yeah, that would be easier. Okay, let's jump over to another question. Let's see, I have one here. Jay Carter asks, what do you look for or enjoy in a game master when you are a player in an RPG? Does what you look for as a player differ from your own personal GM style at all? For me, I don't really think so. I do love playing, being a player in games, but I think this is true for a lot of people who do a lot of game mastering. It often becomes frustrating if the game master doesn't have your particular style, because you're constantly thinking, oh, I would do this and I would do this, and that kind of drives you crazy after a while. But like what I look for in a game master and what I try to be is someone who is relaxed and very engaged with the table and doesn't have as much of the, mysterious dungeon master, all my secrets are behind here and you won't know what's going on, but as someone who is more like a player at the table who is there with you, kind of trying to simulate this world. And they're just as excited to find out what happens in the game as you are. That's probably my biggest thing. When game masters get frustrated that things didn't work out the way that they expected, that really frustrates me as a player, because I want to feel like I'm really part of this world and I can change any part of it, and there's nothing that was supposed to happen, and that what happens was just what we decided happened by what we did in the game. So that's my favorite kind of game master, someone who's like there and excited to see what the players are going to do, and is excited when the players can like break the adventure in some way. I think that's my ideal. How about you guys?
Well, see, as someone who's played in many games where the game master has been broken, not by me, I will hasten to add. My favorite kind of DM style that I like to play in is where you have a DM that engages every player, not just the loudest players. Because every group has them. Every group has someone who feels, because they have the biggest mouth, everyone wants to understand what they say. I've had DMs where they've put the quiet players nearer to them and the loud players at the end of a table, for example. You know, when he's always made up an idea of like, we need to seat it in this way, but you can tell he's done it so the quieter players get a bit more kind of airtime. As for the kind of games I like playing games I don't run. For kind of the reason you've said is like, if it's a game I don't run, if it's a game I generally wouldn't touch, for example, I'm playing against the Dark Master at the moment. That's not a game I would ever be interested in running, but it's a great game to play. So I have no kind of expectation on how I would run it compared to how they would run it. You know, because with that kind of game, it's quite mathy, and that's not really me. I'm more kind of, as a DM, I try to be more cinematic and more that kind of approach. But some of the players in my own group, for example, love the kind of mechanics behind things. And for that kind of game, I would never run it. So I'd rather play games that I would never run for that exact reason, because I have no base of comparison. Then I can just enjoy it as a game.
That's a good approach. I like that. I like to play D&D. But Ben, I think I agree 100% with your evaluation. That's my style too. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen next, and that's the way I like it. And I'm just as happy to find out what happened. To me, that's what keeps my campaigns going on for years, is I can't wait to see what they do next, because I have no idea what's going to happen, you know. And that's the most interesting part of it. I mean, I throw out some seeds and I throw some things out in the air, and I don't know what's going to happen. It's not my problem. It's their problem, you know? So, and then of course I'm not against them. I'm happy when they succeed. And if they beat my bad guy with a critical hit that I didn't expect them to get, that was supposed to be a big thing, well, they do it, you know. And I ran rats in the walls not too long ago with my Hyperborea game. And there's a big bad evil giant rat at the end of the thing. Hope I'm not giving away spoilers. But the barbarian in the party had a halberd, and he ran up and he attacked, rolled a natural 20 and got ×3 on critical hits, and it only had 30 hit points. So guess what? It was dead. One shot, goodbye. And you know what? It was great. The table went insane, and they're still talking about it months later, how awesome that was. For me,
I had a similar thing.
It was like,
yeah, I know what you mean. I was running Night Below, you know, Night Below, the great Carl Sargent campaign for AD&D. And in one particular section of it, you fight, spoilers, you fight a deep dragon. And it surprises the characters from the roof, breathe on everyone, and deep dragons blinded when they breathe on you. So we had a character who was a samurai, don't ask. And he says, right, he had wings of flying, and he said, right, I'm going to do a Kiai shout and fly at the dragon. And I was like, you're blind. He said, I've got blind fighting. So I said, okay, all right, give you a chance. He rolled a 20, and he was like, we used to use remember the tables that were in Dragon magazine, the critical tables back in the day. And then he rolled triple damage, and it worked out 52 points, which, as you know, with AD&D was over 50 points in one blow was massive damage. So being all cocky. I said, I'll roll it save in front of you. Rolled a 1. They all stood up and cheered and danced around the table. And I still get the occasional Twitter message from the guys who played saying, "Do you remember that time we beat that dragon in one blow?" And I think the thing is, that kind of thing is that those kind of things are often more memorable than completing campaigns, just complete flukes where they've looked out completely, and then your cockiness has just made it worse.
Yeah, it's really true that there's an impulse, especially among like new game masters, that like I have to make sure that everything goes according to plan in this adventure, and I want to have like these narrative beats that go up and down, and then there'll be a big fight at the end, and that'll drag out until they've almost lost, and then they'll win. And there's an impulse to create those sort of arcs, whereas sort of letting things lie, where they lay, just however the dice roll, that's how it happens, creates these incredible moments that you wouldn't have expected and are like not good narratives or what have you, but are far more memorable. People remember them forever, whereas they often won't remember the narrative beats that you came up with on your own. I think that's what people
whose
forget
story
about
are you
this.
telling anyway? Is it your story or their story? It's their story.
Right.
Well,
So,
yeah.
that's not my story. It's their story. I'm just here narrating. I'm an impartial person. I set up the parameters for the setting, the campaign, and I'll be introducing the NPCs, and they're going to have their own motivations, and they're going to go and do those things. And some of those things that they're doing may impact you. If I set something up and you don't pursue it, it still happens off screen, and that may affect you later on down the road, or it may not. I don't know. It's in the works, and it may come into play. It may not. I'll look at my notes 6 months from now and see if it matters, and then maybe bring that in if I'm devoid of a storyline or something, like looking for something to get. That's the other thing. You got to keep good notes of everything that they do and things that they come across, and just write it in there, and you'll have it for reference later on down the road, and you'll be able to pull back and look at and see what you might have forgotten about that happened. You go, oh yeah, that thing happened a couple of months ago. I never followed that up. Now's a good time to bring it in.
I think you're right. Good note keeping is a real thing. It's a real bit of advice. And I think a lot of the issue, and it was the same back in the day, was people trying to slavishly follow the plan of a scenario, especially bought ones. One particular one is in a Dark Sun. We played Dark Sun extensively back in the day, and there was one particular adventure, and I can't remember the name of it, but you had to compete in like a kind of like an American football match. But it didn't buy into the fact that characters had certain powers. It was just like, you have to do this thing and you've got to win to get to the next stage. It didn't rely on the fact that you could have like elves in Dark Sun had like stupidly fast movement. And we did this thing in 2 rounds that was meant to take us a whole session because we thought our way around it. The DM had to actually get up, leave the room, and have to stop and think, because he'd only prepared for 1 session of us playing this football match, and we beat it within like 2 rounds. If you're interested in how we beat it, we had the elf got the ball, cast haste on himself, which tripled his movement, and we had a wizard who cast an illusion of the ball being somewhere else. So Amazing. They all chased after this ball. We got it to the end line. We still talk about that to these days. The DM hates that we bring it up.
That's awesome.
That's the best part of playing a wizard. That's why I love playing wizards, because I'm a wizard and I never take any damage spells. I just take all the weird utility spells, and then you can just do the most entertaining stuff with it.
It can be a lot of fun until everybody's like, well, you just cast Fireball.
I cast Sleep instead, because Sleep is better than Fireball.
No saving throw.
the one other thing that people forget about, like, Sleep. Oh yeah, Sleep can be like brutal. Like it can put out like 16 hit dice worth of monsters, and then you can just go around and stab them in the throat, and they're just all dead. Oh man, you can do it level 1. You don't even have to wait until you get Fireball. But I think the thing that people forget about, like the whole OSR style of just like letting the players do what they want, is that it's so much easier to run. Like for me, at least, trying to actually plan things out and create these narrative curves and stuff is so stressful, because then the minute they go off the rails, you're just like, oh my gosh, I have to plan all of this more stuff. But if you just prepare an environment with fun things in it, then the game runs itself, and it's just so much less work. You can just take a load off and just get entertained by what they do.
Yeah, I like I said, I ran 3 5th edition campaigns since its inception, and I recently switched over to Hyperborea, and wow, I don't have a computer with me. I usually ran a computer with me to run the initiatives because my combat tracker and Fantasy Grounds would just calculate all the initiatives for the monsters and the players with a click, right? So and then it had all the monster statistics available, all the spells available, everything there at a click. So I got addicted to that. And so setting up for the game and preparing for the game all was related to getting the computer set up, getting this set up, getting this thing set up, getting maps that I could project onto the screen and do all that kind of stuff. And I got burned out on it, and I just went 100% analog, and I'm having such a great time GMing now. I mean, I was still having a good time, but this is just like a stress reliever as far as prep time goes. You're absolutely right.
You feel more like a player because you're just at the table, just like, I want to see what happens today. Yeah. Let's move on to another question. Bud, do you have another one you wanted to look at?
Let me just bring them one sec. When by Gary Aim, when does an adventure become retro? My quick answer to that is when I forgot that I've bought it. If I can't remember when I bought it, it's retro. It's defining retro though, isn't it? You've got to define what retro really is before you can decide whether an adventure is retro. For example, I would consider Night Below, it's right there, Night Below the campaign to be retro, even though comparatively speaking, it's not that old. It was released in the 90s, I think, or maybe early 2000s, can't remember. I think it's more
like that. I got it sitting on my shelf too.
Yeah, it's around about that kind of period, like late 90s, early 2000s is what I was thinking. I think with retro, it's a lot to do with the style in which it's presented. Because I look at the old kind of, Secret of Salt Marsh and all those kind of things, and they look retro. There's something about the art style, the map, the grid map style, the layout, the way there was hardly ever anything for the GM to read out. It was always just like descriptions of runes and stat blocks, and the GM had to kind of just make it up as they went along. So when does it become retro? You've got to define what your version of retro is. I don't think there's. I mean, I know people who consider 90s music retro, and it's not. You know what I mean? It's your definition of retro. There's no set
time when it can be looked at fondly with nostalgias. It's probably retro. That's not one definition. I think a lot of TSR modules hit that retro stride because they legit are the very first time this thing was ever done. For example, Village of Hamlet is 100% retro. First time a full detailed village was published by TSR. Or you can look at the entire Giant series, which was G1 through G3, and then D1 to D3 and Q1, which is the Queen of the Spiders arc, which basically is a long series of modules that are basically become a complete campaign. First time that's ever done, definitely retro. So I think there's a lot of things that with TSR modules, especially, that are retro because it's the first time anybody ever did it. And so people look at it with fond memories because they were that was the first time they got to play in that, and they can look back on it with some pride. And if you look at the modules today, they don't seem like there's a lot to them, but wow, they were a pretty big deal when they came out.
I think also I mean, it's possible to be a bad adventure and be retro as well.
Oh yeah.
You're saying like you look at it fondly. I can look at some adventures that were absolutely abominations, but they are retro. You know what I mean? It's a hard one to define for me. I mean, that's your actual definition of it, which is something I look back and I enjoyed. I can equally look back at things that I thought were terrible, but understand that they were retro in their own way.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a good definition, since I guess I don't really look at retro stuff exactly. I'm reading the AD&D books slowly, but almost all the books that I review are books from the last 5 years that are, I guess you wouldn't really call them retro because they're not from the past, although they're sort of trying to emulate something about it. When I think about like what counts as OSR stuff in particular, it's more like it has to have a focus on things like exploration and player freedom. So it's more about like the play style than like when it was written. When I think about what I would count as like a retro game, I guess it's sort of that, I don't know what the right word is. It's not nostalgia because I wasn't even around in like the early 80s and the 70s. I didn't exist. So I can't have like nostalgia for that. That doesn't make sense. But there's a sort of like fake nostalgia where you can sort of imagine what things were like back then and you kind of soak in that ambiance. And a lot of OSR stuff tries to emulate that, right? They try and go back to that style of designing adventures and even the art style and the layout. So it is really hard to define, but it's more like a kind of analog aesthetic where you have all of these books that are being made without the aid of, computers, without all of these digital editing tools. And it's mostly game masters' notes and their personal experiences being put into these adventures. I think about like a lot of reading the AD&D books, reading the actual DMG, and how much it just feels like Gary talking to you, which is something that I feel like a lot of more modern books don't have, where they lack a lot of this unique, distinct personalities of just some crazy guy in his basement coming up with all of these ideas and just trying to teach them to you. I feel like that's a big part of what I would classify as retro, I guess.
I think the rise in self-publishing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the big thing. Self-publishing has really made access a lot. We're getting a lot of stuff because of that. A lot of great stuff. It's great to see some of the creative minds out there putting stuff out with the self-publishing.
Yeah.
I think also like if you look at the last couple of Kickstarters, like gosh darn, Old School Essentials did $752,000 in their last Kickstarter. That's amazing. It's amazing. They're not a big deal as far as Wizards of the Coast is concerned, but I think that shows just how popular the OSR really is. And then another one, Hyperborea, a $200,000 Kickstarter. I mean, like, it's not the mainstream, but OSR not being popular, it's not true. I got the dollar amounts to show you that shows that it is popular and that there is real dollars out there for it. So I think it's promising for the future of OSR.
Yeah, indie stuff in general, like the big one was Magpie Games, because they published the Avatar role-playing game that they published on Kickstarter. It made like $8 million or something like that. Just absolutely insane. So like what these independent publishers can do now is totally unprecedented. Like this stuff could never be published just like 10 years ago. And now people are actually able to compete with large established publishers just by using platforms like Kickstarter.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Let's see, who's next? Dave, are you next?
Yeah. So there was I forget me, I can't really read the who asked this question. Sure. Something about traps. What our favorite traps were.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah.
If you got who asked that question, handy.
Go ahead. I'll look it up. It's in here somewhere.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess I feel kind of bad because it was a good question, but I wanted to put this out there because I went over that question as my trap style is I like to show you what's going to happen and let you know that this is going to get you, and then I get you anyway. Prime example of that is you open up a room and you see a room full of spider webs. Clearly, spider's going to get you. So then also just inside the door is a table with a treasure chest on it. You can see the lid slightly open and there's some pearls and jewels hanging out. It's within reach. You could just run in and grab it, maybe get out before the spider got you. So they run and grab the treasure chest, and it's a mimic. And as soon as the mimic gets you, that's when the spider gets you. So that's my 1-2 hammer punch. Another one is you're going down a dungeon corridor, and to the left and the right, you see some drainage grates, common feature in dungeons. And if you listen, you can hear the water trickling, and there's a foul odor coming from below. So obviously most people just pass that on, because who wants to break open the grate and go down there and see what's there? Nobody. So they go on down the corridor, and a little further down the corridor, they're going to find something that's going to require them to stop and engage with it. Probably not in a positive way. But what they don't know is after they leave, their footfalls and their vibrations from their footfalls capture the attention of the gelatinous cube, which oozes through the grate and is now pursuing them down the hallway. So there's no way back. Another, as a 1-2, that's a 1-2 punch. The grate's going to get you. You just don't know how, or whatever it is.
Yeah, like very similar to what you were saying. Like my favorites are ones where you can see the trap. I like making the traps really obvious. So it's just like, oh, look, there's a trap, but then it's going to kill you anyway, because the way that it's going to kill you is you can detect it. Like if you look carefully at what the trap is, you can see how it works. If you tinker around with it and you can experiment with it, you can see how it's going to kill you. And so surviving it is all about doing that kind of hands-on investigating. One of my favorite traps, I brought this up in one of my trap videos a while back. It's like a pit and there's a beam going across it, and you can smell like evil fumes coming up from down below in the trap. That's some sort of bottomless pit. And how the trap works is that if you try and walk across this beam, it's actually on a swivel. So it'll swivel and try and drop you in there. But the swivel also has like, the metal will rub against the side, so that it'll create sparks that fall down into the trap, light the explosive fumes, and there's a giant blast of fire that fries you as you fall in. But every aspect of those, like the bad smelling fumes that are possibly explosive, the fact that the beam swivels, the fact that it might release sparks as it swivels, all of those things you can find out. Like if you just like look carefully and describe to the game master what you're doing. But if you don't do that, then you'll die and it'll be your fault. So I really don't
like Grimtooth.
Yeah, it's like, well, a little bit like Grimtooth. Grimtooth has a lot of like really cheesy traps where like, there is no way I could possibly have known that was going to kill me, right? Those aren't fun. And I don't like traps.
Those are not fun.
They're not fun because it's just like, might as well just drop a boulder on my head. It's like, it's the same thing. And I just don't like traps where there's no way you could have known, or traps that are just hit point taxes, where it's just like, I walk down the hallway. Oh, you spring a blade trap. You lose D6 hit points. Okay, I keep walking, right? It's like, why is that even there? I love traps that are a kind of puzzle, and it's almost like an encounter in itself, right, just dealing with it. It's like players love that. They feel really engaged and they feel awesome when they actually find a way to get past it.
But my best approach to traps was a dungeon I designed back in the day, was getting in there into the dungeon. It was full of false clicks and they were a paranoid mess by the time they got to the end. And then on the way out, all the traps activated.
Oh,
so they had no way to kind of run away and lick the wounds. They were stuck at the end and had to get back out, and all the traps were then active.
That's mean. I love it.
Oh, I love it because like you're telling them, you're just like, you actually activated each trap as you've gone through. So like the information is there for them to figure out. It just, did they pay attention?
This thing's going to get you.
Not enough attention.
Yeah. That's brutal. Okay, let me pick one more here. What did I have here on my list? Okay, so here's a pretty straightforward. Oh, that last one was by Kulkhead.
Good question.
Let's see. Well, now I've lost it. But the basic idea was, what do you look for in particular when you are when an adventure really stands out to you? Because we review a lot of adventures on our channels, and what is it that makes one, tell yourself this is something really great? What distinguishing marks does that have?
Ooh.
I like,
that's a big question.
Yeah.
Character-driven narratives. If it's character-driven, if there's and I'm not just talking about the big bad evil guy at the end. I'm talking about the NPCs that are presented. They all have goals and they have desires that are going to fit into the adventure, that are carefully crafted, that maybe will come back as a callback later on down the road. Those are really interesting, especially when you can engage the player characters directly in some personal way, either through their village or through their parents or some important NPC that they're attached to. Modules that engage the players through character narration are very important, and also have an interesting setting, that have some modularity to them so they can be integrated into an existing campaign. Those are all hallmarks to a good module.
Yeah.
For me, it's see, I recently did a big, huge breakdown of Impossible Landscapes with Delta Green, and by the time I got to the end of it, I actually put it in my final words: short of catastrophic memory loss, I'm never going to get to experience this because it's incredible. And it's when I read something that I get to the end of and think, oh man, I've ruined that for myself now. I can never play that now. I know everything that's going to happen. That's it's kind of a backwards way of doing it, kind of. But that's how I determine whether an adventure is good, because otherwise I wouldn't read it because I'd want to play it. You know, you can hear that some campaigns are great, like 6 Seasons and Sartar for RuneQuest. I'd heard many great things about that, and now I've read it. I wish I hadn't read it. I wish I could have just played it instead because it's so good. Probably the wrong way to determine whether a campaign's any good is to spoil it for yourself, isn't it? But you know, you review stuff, part of the course, isn't it?
It's a good measure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it just like the ideas that are in there, like the kinds of twists and the level of the content? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, got a lot of background noise here.
No problem.
I mean, for something like, for example, 6 Seasons in Sartar, it's the attention to detail. When you've got a game like RuneQuest, which is very fine detail oriented, and you know, there's running jokes throughout RuneQuest about, you know, whenever you play a game, you ask what year it is, because it's like the pre-lunar invasion versus the post, you know, there's all that kind of thing. And when you read something like 6 Seasons in Sartar, it's based on the fact that the guy who wrote it is so intimate with the world, and as someone who loves that lore, it's like gold to read. But unfortunately, I can never play it now because I know what happens.
Yeah. I guess for me, like adding on to the stuff that you said, because I agree with all of that stuff. When I'm looking at adventures, first thing is really practical. Is it optimized for game masters to use? And that seems like one of those obvious things that any adventure should have, but it's shockingly rare to find adventures that are clearly designed for, you're sitting at a table, you need to know what's in this room. Really simple stuff. There's so many books, especially old ones. A lot of early TSR kind of falls to this a little bit, where it's really hard to figure out what's in that room or what order to tell it to players, because it'll have like giant blocks of text, these really long paragraphs, and the secret stuff is mixed in with the obvious stuff. And you have to like read the whole thing and then piece it apart in your head and then rearrange it so that you're telling players what they see first, and then so you can hold back what's going to happen next. That's any way that you can make that easy for me to run, that's going to move it up in my book. And then the other really big thing is optimized for shenanigans. So you can have adventures that are just optimized for players who just love to mess around. And that's about making it location-based adventures where they can explore it in any direction in any way they want, but especially giving them weird tools, magic items, spells, stuff that just does really strange, unexpected stuff, especially things that can interact with each other, so that you as the game master and you as the game designer have no idea how it's going to turn out. And then if you run the adventure several times with different groups, the outcomes will be wildly different because of how they used the different pieces to achieve whatever their goals happen to be. So both of those things together are pretty rare, and that's kind of what I look for, among other things.
I think
that's very good.
Yeah, I think that kind of approach is very obvious in your own scenario, because you had the hall, then you had the hall as things become more active, and then you had the hall where things become more active and the giants looking in trying to get people, and they were 3 different things entirely. And as you say, shenanigan based, there was plenty of room for that in that scenario as well.
Yep, because you have 3 or 4 different factions, all with their own goals, and each one of them is partially randomized for where they're going to go or when they're going to show up, and then which direction are the players going to go and what items are they going to find first. So it's completely unpredictable, and that's what I was aiming for.
Reminds me of my very first dungeon that I ever ran and I ran it at GaryCon recently, is the Tower of Xenopus, which is from the Holmes basic set, which came out in 1977. But that dungeon is pretty interesting. To the north is catacombs and an undead group of undead ghouls and skeletons and that kind of thing. To the south is Thaumaturgus, who's trying to study the level and get what's going on there, and he's charmed a pirate. Now the pirate came from a cave that's to the west of the dungeon, where there's an alcove that leads out into this. It's a sea cave, leads out into the open. So there's smugglers that are bringing in their ill-gotten loot and storing it there in the western cave. But they've also kidnapped Lamunda the Lovely. Now, who she is, I'd make her the mayor's daughter usually, but she's also a capable fighter on her own. But they've kidnapped her for ransom. So how that all comes together with different groups, I've ran that so many times, and how they deal with all those different things. The Thaumaturgus' lair, when he's got like a gorilla in a cage that he's captured, and he's got a fighter that he's charmed, and he's got a wand of paralyzation, and there's a scroll in his lair of which was really amusing. If they find this first, is there's a stone to flesh scroll. It's like, why does he have a stone to flesh scroll? You know, that's always a good question. And at the GaryCon game that I just played, it was really amazing. And shout out to Rex Gunkalicious. He pulled a really great maneuver that I never seen, and Zach Howard from Xenopus Archives was there when he did it. So we both looked at each other and said, wow, that was pretty cool. But I said to them, I said, you can have anything on your character sheet that you want. That's mundane. I don't care. And so he put a small cauldron on there. Now in room N, there's a series of sarcophagi that some have the lids off, some don't. But in one of them, when you pull the lid off, if you mess with the dagger in the claws of the skeleton, it jumps up and attacks you. Now that dagger has only a couple of ways to resolve. It either kills you or and after it strikes or you strike it, it falls inert to the ground. You can either pick it up and put it back in the sarcophagus, and then it will leave you alone, or you can run out of that room as fast as you can while it's inert. And what he did is he took the small cauldron that he had, and he put it on top of the dagger while it was inert, and then they all stacked slabs of sarcophagus lids on top of the cauldron, and I basically had it going ding, 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 trapped under the cauldron. So it's resolved in a way that I've never seen it resolved before. It's pretty clever. And I told him, I said, the next time, and this spoiling for the next time I run this, but that's going to be there for some future group that happens upon the room.
That's great. I love it when like one group leaves changes in a dungeon for another one to experience, or they can come across like the dead bodies of someone else. I've done that before, where there's been dungeons I've run multiple times, and another group comes through and they find the dead corpses of people who were there before, just stacking up.
I think going back to what you look for in adventure as well. I'm absolutely tagging on to what you said, Ben, is the whole idea of making things easy for the GM. That's so important, and I've seen so many scenarios and campaigns that were ruined. Well, not ruined, that were just not as good to be able to run because of the way things were presented. Presentation is a big thing, you know, because bad presentation can put you off running something. But another thing I was going to say is one thing, a particular thing I like in scenarios that I run. It's something to do with impossible landscapes and Masks of Nyarlathotep to a large degree. I mean, these are huge campaigns that I've read cover to cover and written essentially, you know, chapter and verse about. Is optional things, because you have like the main theme, the main kind of thread of the scenario. But when I take an issue is where an optional thing is important for the main scenario, and I don't think they should be. Now, Impossible Landscapes is good at this. You can jump into a chapter, for example, in chapter 2, there's loads of separate things, places you can go and things you can do, but none of them stop you getting from A to B. They all enhance your journey from getting to A to B. You know, it's A being the beginning of the chapter, B being the resolution of the chapter. All they are enhancements. You don't need to do any of them to get to the end. But if you do, you get this more kind of abundant experience playing it. And that's one thing I do like about game design, when they all do something that's an add-on, but it's not important. It's just a bit of extra fun.
Yeah, having secrets in the adventure that they can find and feel like they did that, right? Like even the simplest version of that, just putting secret rooms in dungeons, right? Secret rooms that they don't have to find, but just give them something extra, so that when they find it, they feel rewarded, that they put in the extra work and they found something that maybe no one else did. Just little things like that can just make such a huge difference. It's been about an hour, so I think we will wrap it up. Thank both of you for joining me. This was really a lot of fun. For anyone who is watching, remember to head down to the description below. I will put links to both of their channels. You should subscribe to both of them, because I did, and I didn't regret it. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hey,
Bye.
thanks, Ben. Thanks for having us.
You are
See you later.
welcome.